Hello everyone, thank you for having me here today to give you a guest lecture on my PhD research thesis on a case of disaster justice and the Black Summer bushfires. My name is Anastasia Mortimer. I recently completed my PhD, well not recently, I completed my PhD last year, and this case study is one element of my research on disaster displacement in relation to issues facing Australia. I just want to preface this by saying that disasters are truly traumatizing events, and this was one of the most catastrophic disasters experienced in Australia to date due to its geographical range of impact. Some of you who are listening today may have even been directly or indirectly impacted by Black Summer, and I just want to preface this by saying if you do not feel up to listening to this for whatever reason, please look after yourself. Feel free to leave or switch it off. I completely understand disasters are traumatizing events, and I'm not in the business of causing anyone trauma. So, like I said, feel free. For those of you who feel like you can listen, hello. This research, like I said, is based off my thesis, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of my research and findings and how it relates to the concept of disaster justice. So following on from the lecture earlier today that hopefully you've all listened to, thank you all for listening to me again. I will be discussing the interconnections between Black Summer and human and environmental health. I'll also be examining human and environmental loss in this case study. I'll be looking at disaster governance and how it relates to the concept of disaster justice. And I'll be looking at the link between the crisis, displacement, and climate change. Again, all of this will be under the lens of disaster justice, which follows on from the lecture covered today. So while most of you are probably aware of the Black Summer bushfire season of the year 2019 to 2020, I just want to give some background information for some of you who might not be across all of the details. If you would like to dig deeper into this crisis, I've linked quite a number of sources for you to do your own research, so please feel free to do so. But just to give you an overall background, I'll start by sharing that this Black Summer bushfire season was the worst in Australia's recorded history, which resulted in devastating fires across every state and territory in Australia. Now, in the lead up to Black Summer, we saw a range of hydrological and meteorological and climatological conditions that led to the severity of this crisis in terms of its environmental drivers. So we saw dry and windy weather conditions that occurred between October and November and increased the fire danger rating to severe across most of Eastern Australia. And by December, there was over 50 fires blazing in southern Queensland and up to 125 fires at one point occurring in New South Wales. So fires were also present in South Australia, Victoria, and southern Western Australia. The magnitude of these fires resulted in a declaration of a state of emergency in each Australian state and territory, with major losses occurring in New South Wales and Queensland. During the periods, we saw extreme fire danger. Nearly all fires were extinguished by the end of February 2020, with rainfall events occurring across much of southern and eastern Australia, where we went from a period of higher than average rainfall after these bushfires. So we went from one disaster to another. However, the damage of Black Summer was devastating on biodiversity and people. And this is urging us in the climate space to call for environmental and multi-species justice to address the climate crisis and to protect all of those who are exposed to the adverse impacts of disasters, both human and non-human species. And this is because the Black Summer bushfires highlighted that we have entered into a period of extreme climatological disasters that are a result of anthropogenic climate change. And as mentioned earlier in this week's lectures, this is just one example of the impacts of living in the age of the Anthropocene. So the Black Summer fires provide important insights into disaster management in Australia and how this relates to justice, particularly in terms of emergency response and who gets agency and voice and who is in control of response in this country, who is in control of mitigation and preparedness for these types of crises. It also highlighted that we need better preparation for future bushfire-related disasters in this country so that we can support the rights and needs of people who are most vulnerable and living in highly exposed regions. I'm going to discuss these factors throughout this lecture. And again, just a warning that some of this content might be confronting based off the discussion of human-related losses as a result of these disasters. So Black Summer had devastating and far-reaching impacts on human and non-human species. Today I'm going to focus on ecosystem and biodiversity losses and also human-related losses. And this is because my research looks at that interconnection between environmental and human-related drivers for disasters and the secondary crises of displacement. So firstly, looking at the case from a multi-species perspective, the fires had a detrimental impact on Australia's biodiversity. The area burned by Black Summer included several of Australia's World Heritage listed sites and national heritage places and wetlands of international importance due to them being home to many threatened species and ecological communities. These included the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area and the Gondwana rainforests of Australia in New South Wales and Queensland, and other wilderness areas of Tasmania. It is estimated that approximately 3 billion native vertebrates perished within the rainforest, woodlands and national parks that burned. And this includes fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds and other mammals. Some of these species of flora and fauna are outlined in the slides. Again, please go to the linked site, the linked references if you are interested in looking at this further, but it is difficult to fully encapsulate in such a short lecture the full extent of the biodiversity loss and other environmental impacts that occurred here. And that's because we don't have a lot of monitoring or original baseline data that was being done prior to the fires, during and after the fires, meaning that we will only know the true extent of loss of the flora and fauna once the flow-on effects have been fully realised. But what we do know at present is that Australia has some of the most biodiverse biodiversity in the world. We are a very biodiverse region. The loss that has occurred has long-term impacts for our ecosystems. Like I said, we won't know the full extent of that for quite some years. The fires did occur 5 years ago, but we're only just starting to really account for that detrimental loss. And I'm sure you will remember, for any of those of you who watch the news, that many species were impacted by this, the koala being one of them, and also migratory birds as well. We've lost quite a number of bird populations as a result of Black Summer. And while we're working in the background to try and help restore these practices, as mentioned, these bushfires, we can't truly account for these losses at present. But what we do know is that significant loss has occurred. So Australia is home to an estimated 620,000 species, representing 7 to 10% of all species on Earth. As mentioned, we are a very biologically diverse nation, and so these fires had a large impact on global species populations. The impacts of Black Summer have been described as an ecological disaster. As mentioned, disasters are typically seen in anthropogenic terms, which is why various ecologists are starting to call for ecological disaster recognition, as more than 330 threatened species and 37 threatened ecological communities protected under international and national law were impacted by these fires. So while we can understand that Black Summer had an impact on wildlife and diversity, it is also important to note that biodiversity and ecosystems were threatened due to other impacts before Black Summer. These included changing weather and heat, food availability, deforestation, and other forms of human encroachment on their land. And so Black Summer already amplified the existing ecological crisis being experienced by our diverse species. And so again, when we think about this in a multi-species justice lens, this is just one example of how human-related interventions in nature are having a detrimental impact on the environment, including our flora and fauna. But Black Summer has exacerbated this already pre-existing crisis faced by our wildlife and biodiversity, and many species have now been set on a path of accelerated extinction. Black Summer can be classified as a disaster because of the magnitude of the crisis and the impact it had on human populations. Again, we should be questioning the anthropogenic nature of how we've defined disasters, but not only did this have ecological disaster status, but it had the disaster status that we apply when we think about disasters in general, in the sense of the human-related loss, including to housing, economic damages, to infrastructure, and also the rate of deaths that occurred as a result of this disaster. So one example I'd like to talk about is the secondary impacts of Black Summer. And this will be related to the human health impacts caused by smoke inhalation. Many of us were impacted by Black Summer. We are victims of Black Summer. I'm sure you can remember, depending on where you lived at the time, that the sky was blackened with ash from the fires. At one point, if you looked at images from space, you could not actually see the outline of Australia because of how much smoke was in the atmosphere. As a result, we were breathing in toxic fumes. We were breathing in smoke. It caused an acceleration of asthma occurrences. People experienced various lung conditions. The impact of this in terms of how it impacted human health are far and wide. So smoke from bush fires surrounded much of Australia, and even internationally we saw that smoke from Australia found its way into Indonesia and parts of Papua New Guinea. And so over this season, this caused secondary impacts to human health in Australia and even in areas internationally that weren't directly affected by the fire. Again, this makes us question the nature of environmental justice concerns when there are interstate issues that cross borders when it comes to environmental hazards such as this. It's not just impacting those locally, it has long-term effects internationally as well. So this just demonstrates the magnitude of these fires, considering the impact far and wide. And I'm sure some of you who are listening in the room can remember. But estimates from the Global Fire Emissions Database highlight that the fires contributed to 900 million metric tonnes of carbon emissions, further exacerbating the crisis. So not only were there direct smoke-related consequences, but there were also higher carbon emissions. And that's because the fire burned ancient trees and mangrove forests, which are CO2 stores naturally. They store carbon naturally. And so when they are burnt, that releases the carbon back into the Earth's atmosphere, therefore accelerating greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this also happens through deforestation, which is why deforestation is inherently problematic, because it leads to the release of CO2, which would ordinarily store carbon and protect us from anthropogenic climate change. So researchers estimate that bushfire smoke was responsible for 417 excess deaths. While there were direct deaths from the fire, there were also deaths from those who experienced issues such as cardiovascular problems and respiratory problems. We also saw that 1,300 presentations to emergency departments across Australia occurred during this period due to asthma that was life-threatening in some cases. And so when we think about the human consequences of climate change, we need to think about the adverse impacts of this, such as air pollution, such as smoke inhalation that come from disasters such as wildfires and bushfires. So just quickly, I want to go over some of the causal factors relating to these crises. So numerous environmental factors led to there being the perfect fire conditions for catastrophe. In the months leading up to Black Summer, Australia experienced an extended period of heat waves over much of December 2018 that continued into January 2020. So you can imagine that this is connected also to anthropogenic climate change. The increase of heat does later impact weather systems that would typically be viewed as unprecedented conditions that led to these fires. So we saw that in January 2019, it was the warmest month on record, with monthly mean temperatures above average by about 2.9 degrees Celsius. Spring was Australia's driest spring on record and the 5th warmest on record in Australia's history. So heat continued to affect Australia until the end of the year, bringing repeated periods of severe fire weather across southeastern states of Australia, therefore contributing to the climatological hazard of these extreme bushfire seasons. Another precondition was the droughts that we saw during this period, where there was record low rainfalls throughout Australia. So 2019 was also the driest year on record, and rates of water were very much below the annual means, more so than we've seen in quite some time. So southern and eastern Australia were subject to extended periods of drought in 2018 and 2019, with much of New South Wales and southern Queensland experiencing a third year of dry conditions. The weather was warmer and drier than average, which was conducive to rising the fire risk and fire potential. So drought meant that places such as the Northern Territory, which are known for their tropical monsoonal rain, had the lowest rainfall recorded in history, and rivers literally stopped flowing in areas that are usually abundant with water due to rainfall. Places in New South Wales, such as Dubbo and Broken Hill, were so dry that communities faced severe water shortages. Before Black Summer, it was reported that Dubbo had a month's left of water resources in their community. So you can imagine what that meant in terms of the drought conditions. Also in terms of the ability for communities experiencing drought to actually protect themselves from fire when their consumable water supply was so low, meaning they didn't have an abundance of resources to actually help protect them from disaster. And since early 2017 to 2020, rainfall was near or below previous recorded values for rainfall. So the impact of low rainfall over the period has exacerbated these high temperatures and in turn driven higher rates of evaporation where water is available. So low rainfall also led to very low soil moisture across large areas of Australia, meaning there was limited ecosystem buffers against disaster. Additionally, there was a very strong positive Indian Ocean dipole, or IOD, which sustains temperatures between sea surface temperatures and tropical western and eastern Indian Ocean. And these influence the Australian climate during this period and contributed to very low rainfall and very low humidity, again accelerating the fire conditions. This led to a very high forest fire danger index, and this is what is used in Australia to measure our fire danger. It combines the measurement of dryness based on rainfall and evaporation with meteorological variables for wind speed, temperature and humidity. So by spring 2019, more than 95% of Australia had accumulated forest fire index values that were very much higher than average, including almost 60% of the country with the highest rates on record. The environmental determinants related to Black Summer, such as rainfall deficit, prolonged drought, led to the fires, leading to the fires having an increase in fuel availability. So fuel availability relates to the dryness of the vegetation, which is fuel to fire, essentially. And this led to very high fire danger indexes across the country. As we'll be talking about shortly, the Black Summer bushfire season was unusual because these factors were influenced by climate change. Climate change is influencing fire seasons around the world in terms of the longer number of dry and hot days and seasons globally. A longer fire season is expected to result in more frequent and severe fires. Now, in tying it back to the recent issues we have seen in Los Angeles with their fire, we can see how climate change is impacting changes in terms of our fire season. We saw LA experiencing extreme fires at a time when it's not usually their fire season. And in the case of Black Summer, our fire season during this period started drastically early than was anticipated, again, because of the conditions contributed to by climate change. What this means is, as a result of climate change, we are going to see more frequent, unpredictable, and severe natural disasters or natural hazards that result in disasters, including what we saw in Los Angeles and also here in the case of Black Summer. And also just to highlight that it's difficult to really link to or separate the man-made variables from the natural variables here. And that's because similarly to the issues that we saw in Los Angeles, human decision-making around preparing for disasters often impacts how we have the ability to prepare and mitigate them. We didn't have enough protective equipment to account for such a hazard such as the Black Summer bushfires, and similarly in the US, they did not have enough protective resources to overcome that disaster either. And so that is a key factor we need to think about when we think about living in the age of climate change is, are our governments protecting their citizens from harm? Are citizens prepared for the crisis that awaits them? And how can we better prepare for crisis given our increased risk under climate change? So climate change contributed to record-breaking drought and fire weather conditions, leading to the bushfires being unprecedented across Australia. We saw over 15,000 fires occur over this period, resulting in a combined impact area of up to 19 million hectares of land burnt by them. So this scale is beyond our historical records for fires impacting forested ecosystems in Australia. And it also outstripped our projections for the late 21st century under strong climate scenarios. So scientists often project the likely impact of disasters as a result of climate change and other man-made variables. And the information we had, this disaster exceeded all of our predictions, highlighting how climate change will mean more intense, frequent, and severe disasters. And as mentioned previously, we need to be accounting for that severity, and at present, our governments do not thoroughly account for climate change variables in their projections, which places people at risk. So we'll see probably major challenges to the long-term viability of our ecosystems and also human populations as a result of these climate change variables if we do not take action to address climate change. And while climate change is one factor that has increased the severity of the Black Summer bushfires, fires cannot solely be linked to environmental issues alone. Firstly, anthropogenic climate change is a man-made issue. Additionally, Black Summer highlights that the impacts of poor disaster risk governance has resulted in ecosystem and human-related loss, similarly to the case of the LA fires. So had we had approaches to disaster mitigations factored into climate extremes projections, we could have been better prepared to address this crisis. And preparation was possible because experts have been calling for more climate-related data to be integrated into our projections for fire management systems. So the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, which is an image linked on the screen, who are a governing body for bushfires in this country, forewarned that the 2019 fire season had the potential to be an active fire season across Australia due to weather outlooks and the analysis of poor rainfall. In the lead up to the 2019 season, however, Australian fire chiefs repeatedly spoke to the impending dangers. They were forewarned. They highlighted that they did not have adequate equipment for ad hoc emergency management approaches. They highlighted that there were diminished funding sources to help prepare their volunteer force for these fires. And they also had undeveloped structures in place to support recovery following disasters. And yet these warnings were repeatedly dismissed by federal government prior to Black Summer. So the magnitude of the fire meant that it overwhelmed the capacity of governmental and volunteer agencies to respond to the crisis, which could have been addressed if we had services that were prepared and equipped for the rate of devastation. So by the time the Black Summer fires came to an end on the 20th of March 2020, the fires had destroyed over 3,000 houses in New South Wales. They had killed over 33 people, and we saw that more than 1 billion animals also perished in these fires. And some of these environmental losses and human losses are recorded up on the slides there. But in all categories, this was the worst bushfire disaster, except for mortality rates in Australia's history, which could have been better managed had we adequately accounted for climate change variables in our projections and begun planning for the worst case climate scenario to protect citizens and biodiversity from harm. So these are a product of a variety of interrelated factors, which include natural, social, and political determinants, which contributed to Black Summer becoming a disaster, and which can be summarised in terms of the catastrophic human and non-human related loss and impacts. In terms of the human-related losses related to Black Summer, my research explored the case study of the social, environmental, and built environmental factors that drove displacement following the bushfires. It examined how we can actually map displacement risk hotspots in Australia to better protect highly exposed groups and those who are the most vulnerable to disasters and subsequent displacement. So that is really what my research is interested in doing. It's trying to actually help demonstrate those most at risk so we can target resources to protect those who are experiencing vulnerability to deter future high risk disaster displacement events after a variety of catastrophes in this country. So it's important to link these to the issues of climate and disaster and justice, not only because those who have been displaced by these disasters continue to live in homelessness after these disasters, but because climate change is projected to increase the likelihood of future displacement events in the aftermath of disasters. So displacement following a disaster occurs when buildings or dwellings are damaged or destroyed, leading to homes and communities becoming uninhabitable. It refers to situations where people have to leave their homes or places of residence because of the disaster and the likely impact of the disaster. And disaster displaced people refer to those who are displaced within their country of habitual residence or who have not crossed an international border, for whom environmental degradation, deterioration, or destruction is a major cause of their displacement, although not necessarily the sole one. So displacement could either be temporary and protracted. So temporary is when you have to evacuate to avoid the immediate impact of disaster, but then you get to return home once the danger subsides. Protracted displacement transpires when disasters render people's homes uninhabitable, which could happen to a group or a whole community, where with the possibility or the need to rebuild or for total relocation if the community has been so damaged or deemed too dangerous to return. So in this case, there are reports that people are still experiencing homelessness in the 5 years on from these bushfires. And this is a major injustice in that housing is a foundation to safety, health, and overall well-being. However, as will be discussed shortly, there are also factors in our social, economic and political system that cause people to experience prolonged displacement following the disasters. Now, the reason that people are still experiencing homelessness so long after this disaster is because there's issues with insurance payouts for people, there's issues with housing insecurity in general, which force people to live in less than optimal conditions while they're waiting for housing to be rebuilt or to find alternative accommodation. Now, when I say homelessness, I'm referring to the Australian government's definition of homelessness, which may include living in an overcrowded dwelling, couch surfing or living between the homes of friends and family, or living rough on the streets. In the case of the Black Summer bushfires and subsequent disasters we've seen since, many people might live in tents or other temporary forms of shelter on their properties because they cannot afford to rebuild their homes, or they are waiting for the ability to rebuild their homes from insurance or other capital to help them rebuild. So these factors are contributing to why people are still unhoused so long after this crisis. In any case, it is an example of a disaster injustice. So the Black Summer bushfires resulted in the highest rates of human displacement than at any other time in Australian history. It is estimated that there was a loss of more than 3,000 homes and that over 64,000 people were displaced between July 2019 and February 2020. We are not sure whether those people returned home. We do know that a significant proportion of those people, again, remain in homelessness. However, it is difficult to account for the exact number of those, which again is another disaster injustice because it means that we are not seeing this as the issue it is. These people who are living with vulnerability are flying under the radar, and more needs to be done to protect people from protracted displacement. As I'll mention shortly, protracted displacement leads to a variety of other secondary and tertiary impacts. And so we see people slide further and further and further into social inequity as a result of displacement the longer they experience it, which is why we need more efforts as a nation, but also internationally, to ensure that displacement does not turn from temporary into protracted forms of displacement. So not one thing can be the cause of disaster displacement. What my research has found is that it is the complex interaction of social, economic, political, and environmental determinants that affect human displacement and its consequences. And this is because the impacts of disasters and recovery from such events interact with pre-existing structural vulnerabilities such as poverty, economic insecurity, political insecurity, and resource scarcity, which fuel the conditions in which displacement occurs and which make people vulnerable to displacement. While Australia is not typically seen as a vulnerable nation, people in Australia do experience complex social inequities that are exacerbated in a disaster scenario that do lead to displacement. And this has been seen in the case of Black Summer and also my research onto the Lismore floods. But what I see in my research in the context of Australia displacement and disasters is that displacement is driven by social vulnerability risk factors. It's also driven by weak disaster governance factors. Like I said, we're not planning for climate change in our policy and practice, which means when disasters occur, and they're more severe than anticipated, it leads to detrimental impacts that we're not prepared for and therefore cannot mitigate or address when it happens. There's also a lack of integration of disaster risk reduction principles. People experience economic insecurity in this country, which is a major risk factor. And also, we are one of the most vulnerable nations or highly exposed nations to natural hazards due to our location and a variety of meteorological and hydrological systems that make us vulnerable to disasters. And so these risk factors are evident in Australia and underline the need to examine the phenomenon within the Australian context further so we can help prepare the country for disasters and subsequent displacement. Now, in linking this case study back to concepts of disaster justice, it's important to highlight that people who experience prolonged displacement following this disaster had pre-existing vulnerabilities. So disaster risk, which is the likelihood to experience adverse disaster impacts that prohibit recovery, is a process that stems from the intersection between environmental and socio-economic vulnerabilities and other social issues that bring about a hazard event and that are heightened by it. And these underlying social structures and triggers make people vulnerable to disaster. So those with fewer economic and social resources, such as low-income households or those experiencing receiving a social security payment, older people, people with disability, people with chronic health conditions, and socially isolated people are historically more likely to inhabit substandard housing and live in geographically risky communities that are most exposed to extreme weather events. Such societal factors exacerbate our ecological vulnerability and contribute to disaster risk as the marginalisation of certain groups make them more vulnerable to the impacts of disasters such as displacement. And while these underlying social determinants increase the risk of people pre-event, they also hinder their capacity to recover in the aftermath of the event. And this is why we are seeing such devastation years on from this disaster. It's because people do not have the capacity to overcome the disaster once it's occurred. When you account for the pre-existing social economic factors that they were already contending with before the bushfires. So housing access for economically marginalised groups following the bushfires is a major factor that's prolonging people's displacement. In the context of Australia, there is an ongoing housing affordability crisis that has lasted over a decade and which disproportionately impacts socioeconomically marginalised groups. And when a disaster occurs, the supply and demand of housing is impacted, leading to reduced housing stock and the increase in rental prices. And this means that those who lost their home may be faced with rental insecurity issues post-event, which is what we're seeing in this case. And this happened 5 years ago, and we are still seeing the increasing cost of living crisis that's contributing to people's inability to recover. We're seeing things such as housing unaffordability, energy price increase, cost of living in general with the cost of food. These are all impacting the capacity of people to prepare for and recover from such events. And all of these factors are contributing to some people's experiences of prolonged displacement following the fires. So one of the key things that we saw during the Black Summer crisis was that our buildings, specifically our residential buildings, were very exposed to bushfires. Researchers argue that the reason why housing is so exposed in this example is linked to issues of land use planning or the built environment and also construction standards. So this was noted in the recent Royal Commission into the Black Summer bushfires, where it was stated that approximately 1 million residential buildings in bushfire-prone areas across Australia have limited fire protection. And that's an example about how man-made factors are influencing risk to disasters in the context of Australia. Similarly, we see this in the LA fires as well, begging the question that in the age of climate change, how do we better prepare our expansive human infrastructure to account for climatic disasters? Also, it begs the question about who has the capital to protect their homes in the context of climate change, again bringing up questions of disaster justice concerns. So during the Black Summer fires, 90% of homes lost or damaged were located within 500 metres of declared bushfire-prone zones. And of the lost or damaged homes, 74% were constructed prior to the implementation of legislated construction standards. So this is especially true in New South Wales, which experienced most of the housing loss during the Black Summer fires. And the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry found that future residential housing losses are inevitable, given settlement patterns and legacy bushfire issues arising from previous planning decisions. Again, reiterating how human decision making actually puts people at risk in the context of disasters. So up on the screen are the disaster management arrangements that make up Australia's policy and legislation in relation to how we prepare for, mitigate and recover from disasters. So these policies guide how disasters are planned for, responded to, and how the government respond to crises. And these current approaches fail to adequately address the long-term needs of displaced populations who experience housing loss. So the limited planning for medium and long-term housing resources for people displaced by disasters is reflective of our overarching individualised approach to disaster management, which sees its citizens as responsible for preventing displacement and for managing their own housing recovery following a disaster. Australia's national strategy for disaster resilience suggests that all actors, including individuals, have the obligation to reduce their disaster risk. And this approach advocates for shared responsibilities between governments, communities, businesses, and individuals. Individuals are expected to do their part for resilience through risk mitigation efforts such as insurance and household preparedness. But the focus on self-reliance in Australian disaster management arrangements reflects a neoliberalised disaster governance approach where the notions of individual responsibility are infused with notions of resilience that have been implemented in policy. And again, the major issue with this is that it fails to account for structural inequalities that might impact people's ability to prepare for and recover from disasters. If people do not have the money to upgrade their homes that they had to purchase or live in, because even if it was in a highly exposed area, because that's all they can afford, how then is the onus on them to prepare for disasters that they have not technically created? It's also an issue when you think about how do people who are experiencing intersecting social and economic vulnerability recover from disasters independently, especially when they have other issues such as cost of living crisis. They may have experienced other forms of social marginalisation. This approach is only exacerbating inequality and begs the question, how do we acknowledge the question of justice when we think about climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction? Individualised disaster models, which we're seeing across Australia and also which are becoming more common globally, is inaccessible for most people due to the inequitable distribution of resources and the differential capacities of individuals within these unjust social and ecological systems. Globally, disaster and climate governance approaches fail to address the underlying socio-political factors that might constrain people's capacity to become resilient to climate change. And these include the underlying unequal power relations and injustices that contribute to people's vulnerability to disasters and limit their ability to respond to and recover from them. So this top-down governance strategy actually privileges these unjust social structures that lead to inequality. So by placing the responsibility of resilience on individuals and communities, broader social inequities and injustices are at risk of being reproduced. Displacement is something that needs to be addressed in Australia and internationally when factoring in the increased intensity and frequency of disasters in the face of climate change. So the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre predicts that nearly 1,900 disasters that were triggered over the 2019 period resulted in over 24 million new displacements across 140 countries and territories. And this is the highest figure recorded since 2012 and is 3 times the number of displacement caused by conflict or violence. While Australia is not typically being portrayed as a nation at risk of internal displacement, the Black Summer bushfires of 2019 to 2020 demonstrate that Australia is not immune to a displacement crisis due to climate-induced disasters. It is predicted that by the middle of the century, sudden onset hazards in Australia, such as bushfires, floods, or cyclones, could result in over 28,000 new displacements every single year. And so if we're not accounting for the likelihood of displacement crises under climate change, we will see the emergence of newly vulnerable groups who are being routinely displaced as a result of governance failures to plan for and mitigate disaster-related loss in this country. So that brings us to an end of my formal presentation. However, I understand that I shared some pretty heavy content and I don't want to leave you feeling like we are not able to make change. Through my research and activism, I truly believe that we as individuals and as communities have the power to address climate change, but it does require action. And my ethos or my approach is that it requires structural change. And so I wanted to leave those of you who are interested in contributing to social change with just some avenues where you can actually support climate change at your local level. It's often quite difficult to advocate for yourself or the needs of your community in the political arena. And so I recommend doing so at your local council level is the first place to start, as that's where you can see direct changes in your everyday life being made. So I urge you, if you're interested, to contact your local leaders to ask them to declare a climate emergency or to ask them how they're addressing climate change. They are there to support you and your community needs. They work for us. And so you have the power to request change at your local level. Organisations such as the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action do make this easy. So if you're interested, I recommend you go there. And where we're seeing the most change in Australia in climate action spaces is actually at the local government level. Over 100 councils in Australia have declared a climate emergency. And if your council has not yet declared a climate emergency, you can support such initiatives through political activism. You can write to your local member, you can petition your local member, you can have conversations with your local members to ask them to also declare a climate emergency. There is not one LGA in this country that is not experiencing climate change impacts. And so all councils, it's in their best interest to support this cause to better prepare and mitigate the long-term effects of climate change. And so if you are interested, I recommend you do so. You join the cause, do your part, write a letter. There's also a guide that I've linked to local government climate action that you can do to help support these initiatives. Again, I'm just trying to give you positive, easy solutions to help you feel more empowered to make change. You are by no means obligated to do so, but for those of you who feel like you would like to be a part of it, that's just an easy way you can get involved in climate action. Thank you all so much. If any of you are interested in the space of climate activism or research, please feel free to reach out to me. You can get my details from Jen. I'm always happy to talk to Notre Dame students about this field of practice and research. Thank you all so much and good luck with your semester.